All right. Hello and welcome to Choose FI. Today on the show, we have a returning guest who's actually one of my favorite guests. So we had Court way back when in episode 166. So it's almost 3 years ago. And she just had an amazing story, just an incredible story of being a valuist, of paying off her student loan debt extraordinarily quickly, of coming up with her own part-time shift work in an industry where that was not the norm. And it was just this perfect, beautiful FI story. And her About Us page on her website, I noticed recently, said, Court is currently taking off work for 61 weeks as part of Canada's generous parental leave program to test out the FIRE life. We shall see if she decides to return to the part-time gig in September 2022. As of this update, it's unlikely. So I'm recording this with Court in September of 2022. And I'm just fascinated to hear what the end to this cliffhanger is. So with that, welcome to Choose FI.
You're listening to Choose FI Radio. The blueprint for financial independence lives here. If you're looking to unlock the secrets to financial independence and early retirement, you're in the right place. Stay tuned and join a community of like-minded people who are getting off the hamster wheel and taking control of their lives in the pursuit of financial independence. Choose FI, your home for financial independence online.
Court, I'm so happy to have you back. This is super cool. Thanks for joining me.
Yes, Brad, I'm excited just as well to be back here with you.
Nice. Yeah, this should be fun. So, been a couple years, and you actually, when I mentioned publicly that Jonathan wasn't going to be co-hosting, you actually reached out to me, which is awesome. And you said you have a bunch of updates. And again, from your website that I just figured out here, it sounds like there's a whole bunch of updates. So let's dig in. I mean, there's so much to the story. I guess we should probably catch people back up. I tried to do it a little bit in the intro, but tell me your whole life story in 5 minutes here, Court. Now, tell me about where you are in your FI journey. I think that'll kind of be the best launching point.
Yeah, sure. So when we were last on, we were a family of 3. We reached our FI number for our family of 3 at that point, but I was still working, but I had shifted to a part-time job as this kind of gradual, slow transition to FI, and would highly recommend it. You know, it took me 5 months to decide, should I go to part-time or not? And looking back, I should not have wasted 5 months still in my full-time job deciding that. So for anyone considering, doing a shift like that, definitely recommend that as a side note.
Actually, Court, let me stop you right there if you don't mind. So that 5 months to decide to go to part-time. So I know last time you told us about this shift work, was this like after that shift work or before that? I guess I'm just slightly confused.
That was deciding to go back to shift work for this part-time job.
Gotcha.
I had been working shift work for a large majority of my career, left to do the 9 to 5, which this 9 to 5 in particular involved a lot of travel, a lot of last minute travel, but we were so close to our FI number that I'm like, okay, I'm just going to grind it out for another year or two of full-time work because we were so close to the end. But then it was this part-time shift work job that we talked about in our last conversation that came up that it took me 5 months to decide to go back to this part-time shift work job. And looking back, it was amazing and totally worth it. And especially with a young kid, to be around more doing part-time, would highly, highly recommend it. So yeah, that was where we left off. And then since then, while working that part-time shift work, my wife, Nick, she got pregnant again, and we now have a second child into our clan. So we now have our daughter, Finn, who's a little over 4, and now we have Parker, our son, who's a little over 1. So
cool. Congratulations. That's amazing.
Thank you.
That's so cool.
Thank you. So Nick had stopped working when Finn was born. Back in 2018 was kind of her last time in the office as a nurse. And when Parker was born, I decided to take Canada's generous parental leave as well. And for me, since I wasn't the birth parent, I couldn't take the full 18 months, which is available, but I was able to take 61 weeks, which is still obviously very, very generous, right? And during that time, I was not getting paid my full amount of income. I was getting paid, it comes out to about $22,000 over the course of that time. So for most people, it's hard to do that and financially manage it. But when you are in a good financial position, it's bonus for us, like icing on the cake for me to be able to take off some time, right? So we did that and we moved. We're still living in our same town, but we decided to rent out our townhouse that we were living in and buy a single family home. This was before any of the craziness kicked in, luckily. So we were able to get a good interest rate and a good price on the home. And we rented out our townhouse for about a year and a half. And that was paying for our mortgage of our home. And we just decided to sell our townhouse this past spring when we saw the real estate market had been going up, up, up. So it was a good time to sell. And the price of the sale basically was more than the mortgage of our home.
Nice.
So yeah, so everything's been working out really well. Yeah. And then I got some surprise bonuses from work, like all these things that were just like not expected. So yeah, my parental leave just ended. And yeah, I decided not to return back to work. And it was really not a hard decision at all, especially after being off for over a year. It would have been really, really, really hard to have gone back. And there's a whole crazy story to the return to work setup of some things that were going on at work. But the time off basically sealed the deal that, we are prioritizing being together as a family. We want to be around as involved parents. That is our why right now. So it'd just be silly, in our view, to return back to work for the sake of some more money when we don't necessarily need it.
Wow. Okay, that's quite an update. I love the end to the cliffhanger there, which I guess I'm not altogether surprised by, right?
Yeah.
Man, so what a cool test of Phi that actually wound up being, right? Thank you, Canadian government.
Exactly. It was pretty perfect timing for both of us. Really, when Nick went off on parental leave, the intention was that she was going to go back to work in 2019 when her parental leave was off. And then we realized, for the extra stress, the extra commute going in, it was a 45-minute drive to get to the hospital that she was working at, the daycare setup that we would need with us both working shift work. It just wasn't worth the mental stress and extra, strain on our family at the time. So that was the decision for her not to go back to work. And then for me, yeah, it was amazing that the timing of all of this, we were making really smart financial moves in our 20s, which we didn't know we were going to be looking back and be like, wow, this worked out perfectly now that we're in our 30s with kids, but it really did work out so well that, yeah, we had this kind of the 61-week, lead up to, do I want to go back or not? And it was really nice having that as a backdrop. So we can see, even with inflation going crazy and the stock market's dropping this year, like it still didn't make sense for us to go back. But at least I knew we had that as a fallback plan. And it would not have been the end of the world, of course. But it was nice mentally knowing like, okay, I'm going to take this year off, truly appreciate it, truly embrace it, and then decide, as we get closer to the summer of 2022, do we want to go back or not?
It's so interesting, right? Isn't that the actual Phi story writ large that most people don't realize they have that opportunity? So in your case, this was a very overt thing because of the birth of your son, right? And you get this 61 weeks and, $22,000 is what you wound up getting paid, which the last time we talked, your annual life expenses were only 25. So even if they're a little more than that now, it's still fairly close. So, that's interesting, right? And it was very natural and a natural test for you. But I think to me, actually, that maybe the larger point for people listening is not, move to Canada, which, might not be a terrible idea, right? But it's actually, hey, you can test this, right? As opposed to succumbing to that one more year syndrome or, am I going to have enough? Is this really going to work? What's the worst that happens? The quote unquote failure of Phi would be you going back to a full-time job, which is what you're doing now anyway, or you could maybe find a way to just work part-time. This is someone listening to this, right? Like you can test this and it's not calamitous if it doesn't work out absolutely picture perfectly.
Exactly. And that is my biggest takeaway from this past year. And the biggest thing that I am trying to tell anyone who will listen is instead of 1 year syndrome where you're working that extra year or 2, or maybe it turns into 5 because you want to be so cautious, look at it the other way. Maybe you're at 80% of your FI number or 90% and you're not quite there yet. I can pretty much guarantee that if you make some sort of shift, maybe you work shift work or you reduce your hours where you're only covering your expenses and you're no longer adding into your portfolio. Sure, it might take longer for you to reach your goal target number, but what is your journey going to be like? If you are working another year or 2 or 3 in a very stressful situation just to reach that number versus working 5 years, let's say, in a part-time job, but you are you're fully enjoying, you're living that FI lifestyle earlier, it's probably worth it. And like I keep saying to Nick is, if we didn't reach our number for another year or 2 or 3 because of whatever reasons, like so be it. You're still retiring early at a very early age versus, conventional retirement age. So it's all about just creating the lifestyle along the journey. And if you can start doing that and making some tweaks as you get closer and closer to that final number, that's what I would definitely push and recommend versus being overly cautious. And I am a very overly cautious conservative person, when it comes to finances and everything. So it's very strange for me, someone like me who's, we're withdrawing less than 3%. We are very, very cautious with everything. But if I can go back and I would say, there's very unlikely chance that we will earn $0 from now until the end of time, and that we have to withdraw exactly from our portfolio, the exact amount that we're going to be living on. Like there are so many other ways to bring in some income or to be flexible and reduce your spending if there's a, downturn in the market or things like that. It's all about your flexibility, really. When you're on your journey to FI, it's all about your savings rate and how hardcore do you want to get with that? Are you going to increase your income? Are you going to decrease your expenses? How are we going to stretch that? But when it comes to a post-retirement world, it's all about your flex rate. And I recently read this article from Dave from Strong Money Australia, and he wrote this article called Your Flex Rate, and it totally resonated with what I had been thinking about this past year or two is really just being flexible, being willing to take on some sort of part-time job. Let's say you are spending $40,000 a year in your retirement and you realize, okay, maybe for the first year or 2 or 5 or 10, I don't want to do anything. Great, fine. But there's a very high likely chance that you are going to do something at some point. But even if it's bringing in $5,000, $10,000, let's say, on your $40,000 spend, that's 25% of your spending. That's reducing you from a 4% withdrawal to a 3% withdrawal, which makes your retirement, nearly fail-proof. So it's little tweaks like that thinking, okay, I don't have to be working this super stressful job where I'm making, let's say, $100,000 or something like that. Maybe I can reduce it to a $40,000 job that's way less stressful, easier in terms of commute, everything. And you're just able to kind of glide into your FI target number at that point over those last few years.
Yeah, that's really cool. Well, first, that flex rate article, it's interesting because somebody else sent that to me in the last 48 hours. So it's interesting that you mentioned that. We'll have that in the show notes to this episode. You can always find them at choosefi.com and just go to the podcast section. So pretty easy to find. And yeah, it's interesting. So that flexibility. You're using these words like glide and people talk about coast fi, right? And it's so interesting. I think especially for me and you, because I feel like we're kind of kindred spirits in a lot of senses. That's the sense that I got on our first recording and why I'm so glad to be talking to you again today. And it's like, if you and I, who are super conservative financially, have had these epiphanies in our own lives of, wow, there's so much flexibility here. You don't need to be quite as conservative. And, this again is what we've figured out for ourselves. Obviously, to each person, their own. It truly is personal finance, but it's so hard to mess this up when you're that far along the journey. And it doesn't mean the only successful point is once you've reached that mathematical certainty of FI. As you said, you're creating the lifestyle along the journey. And I think that's the part that I'd love to talk about with you, is creating that lifestyle along the journey.
Yeah, sure. I mean, most people listening who are on the path to financial independence are the go-getter types, where the type A, you're organized, your spreadsheets, maybe not everyone, but you kind of have to take in that role in some respect, take control. You're thinking about future self versus spending right here and right now, right? So it's all about the mindset. That really is what it all comes down to, is figuring out the mindset to delay gratification. And how do you put future you as the front runner and the focus point versus current you wanting to spend and living paycheck to paycheck, right? So that is kind of anyone who's going to excel and take off in the FI space is kind of driven, is a very driven, motivated person. So if you are getting to this point where you're, say, on your journey, you were negative net worth and now you've got to the 0 net worth mark. Amazing. And then you battle and grind to get that first 100,000. That is the hardest, right? You figure out, you're putting all the things in place to get everything automated, right? That is the hardest time. And then you're kind of in this doldrums phase when you're at, the 100,000 mark, and now you need to get to whatever it is, 1 million, 2 million, 500,000, whatever your number is, right? And that's just kind of like, all right, can I get there already? But that's where you need to be focusing on the journey. That is that, instead of it just being this doldrum of like, oh, I'm not there yet. I'm still 7 years away. When am I going to get there? Why is it taking so long? Instead of thinking like that, you start figuring out how to enjoy your life. You've now figured out the financial side of it, but now it's like, okay, what sort of hacks can I do? And I love the word hacks. I think some people come off with the word hacks as like a negative term, but all the hacks podcasts, I love that, right? So it's like, trying to optimize things in different ways, whether you can do things yourself and take more ownership on things, whether it's house projects or building furniture or making things, whatever it may be, or, flipping a van and selling it, physically doing things, I think creates a lot of creativity and a lot of pride, and those are types of things that don't cost a lot of money for, that's just one example of things that you can do during that doldrums phase. Or, figure out how to build your community. And that has been really important for me and part of why I created our blog a couple of years ago. And we've now have about 15 people right in our little town of 40,000 people. It's not a huge place where we live, but we have a FI community here and we meet up all the time. I don't even know how it's worked out, but many of them have kids that are the same age as our kids. So it's great. We've got this little community of, parents who think alike and little kid friends to all hang out with. And we meet at least monthly, if not more. It's just been an amazing experience. And, reaching out to our neighbor and trying to teach them about FI, only if, you kind of tiptoe, find the people who
don't shove it down people's throats, obviously.
Right, exactly. But doing little things like that to better yourself, but also better your community at the same time. And it really goes kind of hand in hand, that it's a win for everyone. You might not be, making any money from any of this, but you are making lasting relationships, which is so important, and building your community and teaching other people about this and, really bettering the world in that sense. And we now have, if you are able on this journey during that doldrums phase to maybe shift down to part-time, well, that might free you up with some extra time to go teach at a library. Maybe you do like a finance 101 class and you just volunteer that way to help other people out. And you're not making the money, but it's going to be more meaningful than the money. And I think that's really hard for a lot of people to really grasp, especially when you're still on the journey. You're like, I just want to get there. And I totally get it because I was there too. But now that we're kind of beyond that, I'm just like, okay, now what else can we do? Which I'm sure is part of why you have this podcast, right? Like it's all about giving, right? And helping other people and connecting. So I'm sure you can relate to many of this. But, it's just so fulfilling to know that there's other people around you and like-minded people. And I find when I find those people personally, we connect instantly. I feel like I can just share and open up so much easier. And you just have this better like baseline grounding of this talking point with them. And you just feel more comfortable because they're kind of on the same wavelength. Maybe not with everything 100%, of course, but with what finances are a huge part of your life, really. And if you can connect with someone on that level, it really just opens it up to be able to talk more openly about many other things too.
Yeah, agreed. It's like that one thing in common is just so important, especially when it's FI, right? It's kind of like this operating system of your life. And like you said, obviously we have people from all different parts of the world, different thoughts. And it's not to say it's one common community where everyone thinks in lockstep. I mean, that would be ridiculous, right? This is a worldwide community of people. But again, when you have that one basic thing that is that is in common, it really matters. And I mean, I think that's why we tried to set up those Choose FI local groups so many years ago. And of course, obviously, amidst COVID, there's been not quite as many in-person meetups. But from what I can see, these groups are really starting to thrive again, across the US, across the world. So yeah, for anybody listening who's not in a Choose FI local group, go to just our website, choosefi.com/local. And you can find a list of like 300 of these groups. And if it's not active anymore, restart it, right? Like be the person who changes that, which is super cool. But, I wanted to dive into that where you said about the doldrums. I think that is the best reframing of that time period where people get kind of anxious and like, oh, should I be doing something, ... right? Like, should I come up with some advanced personal finance trick or hack? Is there some way I can invest that like super rich people are doing? And I mean, from anything that I've ever seen in the world, like none of that stuff exists. It's all just like, it's kind of a farce. It's laying the ground game. And like you're saying, okay, you get on the path to FI. You start figuring out your budget. You start cutting expenses. You just start trying to earn some more income. And you get to net worth zero. You get to that first 100,000 and you've figured out, you've laid the financial ground game, as our good friend Jonathan used to call it, right? So once you've laid the financial ground game, there aren't any more secrets that I've ever come across, right? And it is then a matter of time. It's a matter of compounding. It's a matter of your savings rate, right? But as you said, like there's that down period that is so beautifully, as you called it, the doldrums, because on some level financially, it feels like that, even though things are going amazingly, there's just not that much to do. But what if you reframe that and said, oh, this can be my time period where I can figure out what the heck I want my life to look like? Court, that's the best reframing I've ever heard.
Yeah, I mean, because it takes a couple years, whether it's 5 or 10 or 15, depending on your...
It could take decades.
Right, exactly. And that's okay. Like, I think so many people put people like us on a pedestal who have reached this in their 30s. And it is an amazing feeling. Don't get me wrong. And I'm super proud of what we've done. But if you're retiring, for us, let's say if we reduced our savings rate and we're retiring in our 40s instead, or our 50s, like it's still amazing and beautiful if you are enjoying that journey along the way. It's that combination of the both, of having your finances in control, but also your lifestyle in control, and it's hard because many people get so focused on FI and wanting to reach that number and solely focusing on their savings rate that they're willing to work 60, 70, 80 hours a week, pick up all this extra overtime and get there super fast. Like, Mad Fientist, he talks about it all the time, how he's like grind. And then he was a little depressed when everything happened because he's like, who am I? And I'm sure he's not the only one, right? Which is why it's great to see the evolution of FI and FIRE with Coast FI and Slow FI and all these different other concepts coming up, because you're realizing, it's not all about this grind and just to get there. It's also about this balance of figuring out, what do I want to do? Do I value travel? And then if you do, start traveling now. It doesn't have to wait until the very end. And I think, that's the hardest part for many people to realize, is that you can't do that. Well, I mean, you sure can, but I think it would be more enjoyable if you do this gradual, lead up to your FI number. And like I said, even if you're not all the way there, take some sort of shift. Take a sabbatical, take 6 months off, shift to part-time, something like that, to start really creating that life really how you want it to be in this post-FIRE world, even before you get there. And I know I am a huge fan of Early Retirement Now and his entire Safe Withdrawal Rate series. And I've read every single post and I agree wholeheartedly with all of it. But I think the biggest thing that gets missed is we are not robots. We are humans. Like, we are not going to see our portfolio go from, say, $1 million down to zero. We are not going to do that. And even if it does happen to go all the way down to zero, then we're back to where 95% of the world is, working a full-time job, right? So, I mean, we're really not going to see that happen. If it means, okay, we're going to reduce our spending in some ways or start working some little part-time job that's super low stress, those things are going to happen. And there's so much focus on the math and the numbers, which is super important. I was a math major, like I get all the math, but I think there's also the human component too, which should not be overlooked.
Yeah, and to me, the human component is 90% of it at this point. That's kind of where I've come down. And it used to be the math. Again, you're a math major, I'm a CPA. So, I mean, it seemed like it was the math, but in talking to enough people, like you said, Brandon, the mad scientist is a perfect example. Like, it's so anticlimactic when you reach that FI number and that is all you've ever thought about. Like, if you get to that point where that is the be all end all, well, you're going to wake up on the other side of it and say, what the heck am I doing with my life? It's not about the money. It truly isn't. The money makes everything easier, right? And
Yes.
it, like you said, we'd be fools to say that this hasn't been extraordinary and that money hasn't been at the heart of it, right? By no means are we saying that.
Right.
But if that was it, if that was the limit of I have succeeded in life when I get to this number on a page, you're going to have a very, very empty life. And I think that's why taking those years, those doldrum years, and when I kind of jokingly said it could take decades, I actually didn't mean, obviously it could take decades to get to FI, right? Clearly. But I even mean like it could take decades to figure out what you want your life to look like, frankly, because it's constantly changing. And I think that's another thing we need to be aware of is, hey, your likes, the place you are in your life, in the world, wherever you are, like those things change all the time. And I think that's one of the beautiful thought processes and benefits of FI is like you can be aware of the fact that things are always changing because we're looking a little bit down the road. I think that's how I look at it. It's like this is kind of like a game financially where we're always looking for like, what's the lay of the land? What does the field look like? What are the rules of the game? And how do I adapt? And you have to be aware that you're going to need to adapt to your life circumstances as well.
Exactly. And to that point, like just an extra thing is if you don't have the time because you're so focused on work, you don't know what your interests are at that time and when things are changing. Like you don't have any free time to think like that. And that's another beauty of FI is, just being able to sit and think and make some goals or think about what you want to be focused on. Like most people don't have the time for that, which is really, really sad. So, that's another reason to maybe not be in this 80-hour work week type of setup. You just can't even think about anything besides work. And that just, of course, leads to additional, stresses and health-related issues. And, there's so many other downsides to it. But one of them is that you don't even know who you are or what your interests are, or things like that. And it's really sad to think about. But once you do reach this other side, you realize, okay, like I have all this free time. You can design your days exactly how you want them to be. They can be as busy or not busy as you want them to be. And it's funny, we had a friend over the other day and I was looking at our calendar and I'm old school and have the printout written down, with the pencil
Nice.
Calendar. And she was looking at it and she's like, wow, you guys have a lot of stuff on your plate. And it's all kid related, free classes. It's really a catch-22 when you reach FI, especially for kids. There are all these free classes going on, but they're in the middle of the day. So most people who have their kid, who are paying to have their kids at daycare, childcare year round, can't access these free things. So it's like, yeah, our days are busy, but it's not costing us a lot of money to be able to do these things. But it's, it's having the time to look up what's going on in our community, having the time to know what our kid is actually interested in, all these little things that like just take a little bit of effort and a little bit of time. And if you don't have it, it's sad. Your days and weeks and lives just go by. And so, yeah, that's why I feel like this journey should not, and I know like you and many other guests, harp on this too, but it's just so important to enjoy the journey along the way, or else, like you said, it's going to be this like wake up call and you're like, whoa, what's going on with my life right now? I've reached this number, but I don't know what to do with my days.
Yeah, for sure. And I actually wanted to ask you about all those free things. So, we love to kind of alternate here between like the very theoretical, but then like the very practical, actionable tips. So Liz from Frugal Woods, as you remember, was on the show. And like she talked about way back in episode 12 about how actually living in a city, sometimes you think it's extraordinarily expensive, but that's one aspect of it. It might be if you live in New York City, rent is extremely expensive, but yet there are tens of thousands of free things to do. And I know you're in Western Canada. I'm pretty sure you're in the Calgary area. I don't know if you're in a city proper, but where do you find free activities for your kids and your family? Like, are there any particular places you found that are really valuable, or like just advice you would give in terms of finding those things?
Yeah, so we're in Cochrane, which is just outside of Calgary. And for any Canadians listening, come move to Cochrane. It's amazing.
Nice.
But it's full of young families, which is what we love. And where we moved, it's the central part of our town. So it takes us about 35 minutes to get to downtown Calgary. So we have access to kind of the things that are going on locally in our town that we can walk to, or we can drive into a bigger city with, over 1 million people and that has way more things going on. So in our town specifically, we have a library, and the library, everyone should be checking out their library, not only for books and ebooks and audiobooks, but ours has a tool rental, for example. They have camping gear. They have art equipment. They have so many things, life jackets. I mean, so many random things that you're not thinking, oh, I should check the library for that. So that's one easy way to cut out some expenses. Do I need a saw for one time a year? Go borrow it from the library instead of buying the equipment for however much it costs. But then in terms of kids stuff, they have so many kids classes. Like ours does a Lego day once a week where they just come and they put all sorts of Lego out on the table and it's just kind of free play. So it's great. Lego is very expensive, as any parent knows. So this can just be a way to go and use free Lego, right? But then there's many other things. They have, story time, they have art classes, they have a mindfulness class, they have yoga classes, so many things that you just need to be aware of them and go to the events page to look for them. And then in Calgary, they have even more classes at the different libraries there. We have something called a family resource network here, which is in different towns throughout Canada. I'm not sure if there's something similar in the States, but it's funded through the government. So all the classes are free, but they have preschool classes, toddler classes, baby classes, breastfeeding classes, all sorts of things there where it's kind of like a Montessori-esque room where it's just this big open room with a whole bunch of toys and they rotate it. So again, you don't need to buy as many toys because you're just going there once or twice a week instead and using the toys there. And it's a little change up for you and the kids, right? So those are kind of our daily things that we do. There's a music class that's offered each week. I mean, there are so many things if you look for it. For us, we read the newspaper. We get hand-delivered newspapers coming to our door, which is so, archaic these days.
We do too, actually. We're one of the proud few remaining people.
Yes. Yeah, same here. I love getting the newspaper and just flipping through. But again, it's having the time to look through, right? But there'll be a greenhouse on wheels that will come and go to different parts of town, and you can go and speak to beekeepers or things like that. They have bike parks and skate parks and paths. Just going for a bike ride or going to a playground is free. It's easy and kids love it, right? You don't need to make it crazy. But other things that we do spend money on is for example, we'll buy a zoo pass for $200 for the year for our family, which is pricey. But if you're going 1 or 2 times a year, ouch. But if you are working less, now we can go 20, 30 times a year. And, the cost of each time you're going is quite low. So doing things like that, really, kids do not have to be that expensive. And I'm a crazy tracker. I track everything. And we have not spent more than $5,000 in a given year for our daughter in her 4 years so far. And $2,500 of that is going towards her RESPs, which is the equivalent. It's a 529 in the States. And then about $1,000 towards her food. So on average, we're spending about $1,000. Some years it's less than that on our daughter on everything else, whether it's clothes, activities, toys, games, you name it, the zoo pass, things like that are all included in that number. So I think, a lot of people feel like they have to spend a lot of money on their kids, especially if they're not around and present, and they feel like they're going to buy their love, if that makes sense. And really, kids just want your time and attention and love, which comes at no cost, So if you get some library books and just read to them for an hour, that's going to be more enjoyable for them. Snuggle up on the couch with a snack. That's what they're going to want to do versus paying, $100 for whatever the experience might be. So I think it's, again, it's the mindset shift that we don't need to be spending a lot of money on anything. And that's just, one example with kids, but so many things you can apply that same sort of, mental logic to, just to help keep your costs down.
Yeah. And I mean, that goes back to, as you said a couple of minutes ago, your why, which is, you want to be stay-at-home parents. And that's an amazing thing, to spend time with your children. Again, this is what's so cool about having this flexibility, right? It comes back to that word, which you also mentioned is so critical, is flexibility. So yeah, I mean, it's astonishing how many free activities there are. I think that's a big takeaway. Yes. We're huge fans, as we've always said, Choose a Pie, friends of the library. That's an easy way. There's, your town, your city, there are parks, there's everything. I just found my brother told me about a thing called Park Run, which is really big in the UK, but it looks like a couple hundred locations in the US. It looks like 40 some odd in Canada. It's just free 5K races that are held like every Saturday. And it's just super cool. I went to my first one a couple of weeks ago, and it's just like a neat group of people. And that's maybe even the bigger takeaway, right? It's like, you never know when you're going to find your tribe at an event that is of similar interest. Like everybody was meeting at a coffee shop afterwards to hang out. And like, sure, I didn't go that first time, but I might go the next time because I know it's there. And you never know when you run into people who are going to be lifelong friends. And I think that's really, really neat. Hey, this is Brad. I wanted to let you know we're changing things up a little bit. I'm going away for the foreseeable future from traditional advertising, and we're actually going to partner with some of my favorite podcasts to cross-promote our shows. So they tell their audience about Choose FI, and I tell you, our community, about, again, some of my favorite shows. So it works out beautifully. So give them a try. Hit subscribe, check them out, and let me know what you think. I listen to a lot of podcasts. The Tim Ferriss Show has always been my favorite by far, but for the first time ever, there's a real rival for that top spot. It's a show called My First Million. When I see a new episode show up in my podcast player, it's a drop everything and listen kind of situation for me. The show is all about business building and growth hacking, from how to make $1,000 in a weekend type side hustles to billion-dollar ideas and everything in between. The show is fun, it's infectious. The hosts, Sam Parr and Sean Perry, have an amazing rapport. In fact, if you're a longtime Choose FI fan, I think you'll find it's the closest thing to me and Jonathan you've ever heard. And Sam and Sean are legit. They've built and sold 8-figure businesses to HubSpot and Amazon, and they have an amazing network of friends and colleagues they get on the show to share their wisdom. If I lost everything and had to start over from scratch, I can honestly say the first place I'd start is with My First Million. I think the mindset of business building they cultivate is unmatched, so I'd seriously just listen to every episode in their feed and go from there. The show is a little bit of an acquired taste, but as you get to know Sam and Sean, you'll see just how brilliant they are. So take my word for it and listen to at least a handful of episodes. I think you'll love it. So search for My First Million. That's My First Million on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. I wanted to drill down real quick. So obviously we're talking free, but not everything about FI is about pinching pennies, as you and I obviously both know. But you mentioned like annual passes for entertainment. And I think that's actually a really cool, cost-effective way. You can do a lot of activities that, again, not free, but super low cost. And like you said, if you go once or twice a year, probably not worth it. But if you're at FI or you have some flexibility and you build it into your life and you go once a week or a couple times a month, like it winds up being just almost free every single time you go. We have a couple of a botanical garden and other events. We actually went up buying, this is a little more expensive, though not terribly so, is to a local amusement park. So it was like $150 for a 12-month amusement park pass, including parking. So it's not even like they get you, on $40 to park or whatever. And the place is 25 minutes from our house. So we're able to go there now as a family. My daughters love roller coasters, and we could zip over there, stay for an hour, and come back home, and it's not that big a deal. So I think that's kind of a cool one. So I know you mentioned a couple, but in the first episode we recorded, it sounded like you did a bunch of those annual passes. Is there like any that really jump out to you?
Yeah, well, before we talk about that, the one little caveat for the annual pass is I would say do one a year. So maybe do the zoo 1 year and then do a petting zoo the next year and then do the science center next year. Or maybe, pick and choose 2 instead of 10 of the things that you have, because then you end up only going to each one a couple times a year, right? So that would be kind of the one caveat to all of this is, decide on where you are in your life. Is the amusement for us, an amusement park is not going to get much use, but once our kids are older, yes, so there is a type of place that we did just start going to this year that does have like little kid amusement rides and they're loving it. So that would kind of be the one for this year. It's this place called Heritage Park. It's a mix of reenaction of what life used to look like 100 years ago, and it's many acres, and they have old school buildings and old house that used to be a hospital, and each day it's a rotating like exhibit that's going on. But then they also have little entertainment area for kids with little like old school like rides, like a merry-go-round and a Ferris wheel and things like that. Super simple, but for a 4-year-old, it's the best thing ever. So we'll probably keep doing that for the next couple of years. And again, like a couple $100 for the pass for the year. And then the petting zoo. Both of our kids are now into petting zoos and petting animals. So those are the two kind of that we've combined for this year. But yeah, I mean, it's just being aware of what's out there. You know, we have the Science Center, and again, it's a couple $100 for the annual pass, but at our Family Resource Network, they have access to a pass that you can request. So whenever we want to go to the Science Center, we just put in a request to them and we get the pass for free for a day. So it's, you know, finding little hacks in that sense of like, how can I keep doing all the things that I want to do at a lower or free cost? And that's another, you know, skill out there is knowing about these things, right? And asking around and being willing to ask, you know, your neighbors or your friends or people at the park, like, so what do you do? How much does it cost? So what are things are going on? Or finding local groups. And that's what we've done too, is we found some local mom groups, and they are always posting things that are going on, whether it's just meeting up at a park, and that's obviously free, or, you know, this thing is going on. This month, the dinosaur museum is free. So whoever wants to go, this is the month to go. Things like that, where you wouldn't know if you weren't involved in these groups, right? But again, it takes time to be able to read through what's being posted, right?
Yeah, no, it certainly takes time, and it takes, that little bit of energy and kind of initiative, right? Of actually knowing, okay, all these things exist. I just have to find them. And then it becomes kind of a fun game to, how can we test this? How can we try new things and see what works for us? Because obviously not everything that's free is going to work for you, right? Like that's the cool thing of having so many options. Like you can test all this stuff out. So yeah, that's awesome. And hey, I wanted another kind of question that I've been meaning to ask you, and there's actually an update to it, which is super cool. So it sounds like you said you rented, so you and Nick had a townhouse, and I believe in Calgary, right? So you then rented that for a year and a half. And I remember from our first episode that you had some type of real estate that you were renting in Florida. And it sounded like both of them were going successfully, but then you sold them both. So it doesn't sound like being landlords is exactly your cup of tea, but talk me through that. So you have what sounds like, and again, I don't know the numbers, but you have successful rental real estate, but then you sold them both. And let's talk through that, because I think rental real estate sounds like this, like, oh, that's the end all be all for a lot of people. And like, I don't know that it necessarily is. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, since you've experienced it twice now.
Yeah. So in Florida, when we were still living down there, we had our townhouse. And when we moved up to Canada, we moved to this town, Cochrane, which is just outside of Calgary, and bought a townhouse up here. And we decided to hold on to our townhouse down in Florida and rent that out. And while we were living there, we were also renting out the rooms prior to the move up to Calgary. So we had some sort of, real estate experience in that sense, that we had roommates, and that was our house hacking, experience of being able to pay off our house so quickly. And we kept on to that Florida townhouse for another 2 years. The tenants were amazing, never had any sort of issues. They were very handy, no issues. But we were living across the continent, and that created a mental issue more for me, is like, I physically am not there. I don't have any control, and I am a control freak. So that was more the reason of why we sold that house. And then for the townhouse that we purchased here in 2016, when we moved up to Canada, we were living in that. And that's what we then rented out in 2020 when we moved to our home, our single family home. And we were renting that out for about a year and a half. And again, no issues. Rent was paid on time. The tenants weren't as, sincere, I guess, but we weren't creating a relationship with them, but no major issues. And we just realized we do not want to be landlords. We want to simplify our life. That has been a big thing for us over the last year or two, really for a while, but a big focus in the last year or two, especially as we were approaching early retirement. It's like, we didn't want to get a text at 2 a.m. We don't want to have to scramble to find a whoever, some repairman that we don't know exists because there's a new leak in the house and we don't know who caused it or how big it is. We just didn't want that it just helps with the sleep at night factor, and which is really big for us. And to that sense with simplifying things, is like we're trying to just simplify our portfolio in that sense too. Like you were saying before, people in that doldrums phase are trying to find that next big thing. And I'm going to invest a little bit in this and a little bit in that. It's like, my advice is like, no, it's boring. Like the investing side is boring as well. Like keep things simple. Don't check your accounts. Like that is what is going to put you in a better spot than obsessively checking over your net worth. So yeah, from the landlord side, it made us money definitely by having roommates, and we had rental income, and that was basically paying our mortgage for us. So it definitely helped from a financial standpoint, absolutely. But it is not something that we want to keep doing long term, because like I said, like we are in a good spot financially. Our spending has gone up. So last time we talked, we were spending around $25,000. We now have another kid. We've done some more travel. We had some repairs going on. So last year we spent closer to $40,000, just under it. But even with that extra spend, like we didn't need the extra rental income. It just didn't need to be necessary for us. So it was more from a financial standpoint, same idea with like paying off our mortgage. Like we want to be mortgage free. It's just, we don't want all these extras that we have to think about. We don't want the mortgage payment. We don't want the tenants. We don't want to have to be thinking about all this stuff, when maybe from a financial standpoint, that might not be the most, savvy financial move. And we might be ahead, 20 years from now, if we were to keep the townhouse and keep renting it out, or hold on to the mortgage and be investing instead. But it's just not something that we value. And like, Brad, we are valueless. So it's like, we value simplicity right now. So that is where we are focused. Really, it's like, we want to be able to spend the time reading to our kids versus checking an email because so-and-so popped up. We just don't want to be dealing with that right now.
Yeah, I hear you. And I love, there's really the intersection, right, between, as you just said, we might be ahead 20 years from now if we did the mathematically optimal thing, and that one more year syndrome that we talk about, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's the same psychology of, okay, the only way to win is to come out with the highest net worth. And I think both of us would say that's just like categorically false, right? Like sometimes simplifying your life makes sense. Sometimes spending, in your case now, 60% more. If you think about it, that probably makes your skin crawl, right? But like to go from 25,000 to 40,000, and you're not batting an eyelash because it doesn't matter, right? Because you've set your financial lives up that you were probably only withdrawing, and if you probably weren't even doing this, but 1 or 2% of your portfolio, and now you're at whatever, 3 or whatever it may be, you're still very, very comfortable, right? And like, that's the beautiful thing. Like, sure, rental real estate sounds fantastic to people, but if you get a call at 2 a.m, or even frankly, if you have a property manager and you're never getting those calls, well, if you don't have a tenant, that can be stressful. Whatever it may be, you need a new HVAC system. I just got a call from my property in Georgia that, it looks like the HVAC system, thankfully we were able to get it fixed without replacing it. But that's $5,000 or $6,000, and there's an entire year's worth of income, right? And like,
exactly.
And I'm smart enough with the numbers to know that obviously life is lumpy, as we say, which means like, okay, if you replace the HVAC system now, chances are you've got 14 more years and you amortize it across. But that's the accountant part of me talking, not the, oh man, I've got to cut a check for $5,000 and I don't really feel like doing that on my little $50,000 property in Georgia. That's a lot of money. So it's interesting that simplifying our lives. I think that's something I hope people take away from this.
Yes. And yeah, to your number with the 60%, it does sound crazy. But if it was 60% of spending $100,000 and now I'm adding another 60, that's a big difference. And it still is, right? But like you said, we've planned for this. We're still under 3% withdrawal, even spending $40,000. And I love Canada, as you know. And
I knew this was going to come back to Canada. I could sense it, that my jealousy was going to pop back up again.
And the other kind of crazy part, this was not part of our planning process at all. But in Canada, you get something called Canada Child Benefit for having kids. Basically, it depends on the number of kids, the age of the kids, and your income. Those are kind of the 3 factors. And right now, it's all based off of previous years' reporting and everything. Right now, we're getting close to $8,000 of tax-free money for our 2 kids. And it'll push through in about 2 years. when we have this lower amount to be reporting, we're going to be getting about $18,000 in tax-free money from different federal and provincial benefits that are out there simply for having 2 kids. It's just mind-blowing. And then when you think, okay, well, we're spending 40, well, that 18,000 of that 40 is a huge number, right? Just so many crazy little things. And this is why like that whole flex rate is like, this is not something we were planning in our numbers, but it's just something that happens to be available to us. It's like, okay, like obviously we're not encouraging people to bank on anything external. Like that is not what I'm saying with any of this, but it's just this aha moment that we had is like, wow, like this is actually a substantial amount of money that we're going to be receiving. And so that also helps with our sleep at night factor, and keeping things simple. And we might not be optimizing things, but by having so that will bring us below 2%, even at a $40,000 spend, even $50,000 spend, $60,000 spend. I mean, we haven't converted our US to Canada currency when we're talking about these numbers too. So our withdrawal is super, super low. And so that definitely helps too. We factored in all the one-off things that might come up, a new roof, a new fence, things like that, new car. And even with all of that, we're sleeping well. So part of me says, yes, be very, fiscally responsible and run your numbers and know what your numbers are. But at the same time, take some chances. And especially if you do have kids, young kids, like this is the time to be at home with them. Like when they are teenagers and beyond, they're not going to want to be hanging out with their parents as much as they are when they are little, right? Not saying that you lose your relationship with them completely, but you know what I mean.
Of course.
So this is the time I feel like if you wanted to be involved and kind of shape their future and, that sort of thought process, like take that leap, go and have maybe one of you be a stay-at-home parent. And there are some financial benefits maybe to being a stay-at-home parent. You don't have the childcare costs and the commute and the gas and all, the list goes on, that it might be worth, taking a financial look and saying, would it make sense for one of us to go to part-time or see if we can work from home a couple of days a week to reduce childcare costs or things like that. So sorry, I went on a tangent there, but
no,
I feel like there's just different ways to reframe your journey. And I think that's what we've got across on this episode here. But,
No, that's what it is. It really is about that flexibility, right? Which is this word we've used throughout the entire episode. And it is a mindset, but it's a mindset of just being open and flexible to things change. And I need to be aware of that. And that's like, that to me is exciting. I love that. So, speaking of flexibility and change is, okay, you're at FI. Neither you nor Nick are working now, right? Like you might still have some of this residual income coming in from the Canadian government. So I'm not sure if like you've actually started your drawdown, but like this is something that I think people listening to the show and in the FI community, as they're maybe in that doldrums period, they're thinking about what does it look like when I actually do this? Like it sounds good in theory. I have my portfolio and I can withdraw 3 or 4%. But what does that actually look like? And I think like you're either there in terms of like you're a couple months into this or you're just about there. Like, how are you thinking through this if you haven't done it already? Like, talk me through that because I think this can be really helpful for a lot of people.
Yeah, for sure. So earlier in this year, we had the townhouse sale. So that plays into part of this. I also received a much larger work bonus than I ever thought I was going to get. So those two things have definitely helped and changed things a little bit for our specific scenario. But for when we sold our townhouse, we had this large mortgage on our house and the original plan was just to pay it off completely. But what we decided to do instead is we were able to lock in Canada, you can lock in for a max of 5 years instead of the typical 25, 30-year rates in the US. So we locked in for 5 years at 2.04%. And we were able to get a GIC, which is kind of like a CD in the States, like a longer term locked in savings rate. And we were able to lock it in for 4.7% for 3 years. So basically what we're doing is we're holding on to the mortgage, but the interest that we're going to be earning from the GIC is going to more than offset the interest that we owe on the mortgage. And we're going to be earning close to $10,000 a year simply by having the structure in place and holding on to our mortgage and having our money parked in this GIC. So the plan is still in 3 years, once the GICs are up, we'll then pay off the mortgage because then our 5-year rate will be done and we'll be done with the mortgage. But this is providing us basically an extra $10,000 a year of just holding on to things. So that's part of the withdrawal, is to have this extra interest earned by holding on to a mortgage / GIC. And then we also have cash on hand. So I'm a big fan of having a cash cushion. So we have about 2 years worth of cash just in a high interest savings account right now. And that accounts for our spending, our RESP contributions over the next 2 years, our TFSAs, which is like a Roth IRA, but it's not based off of work and employment. So our TFSA contributions and things like that are kind of parked for 2 years aside. So we won't have to touch any sort of sales from our portfolio for the first 2 years. So that's kind of the initial thought. And then in Canada, we have RRSPs, which are like 401k, but you can withdraw them anytime. There's no sort of penalty involved for any sort of early withdrawals. We have a TFSA, which is like a Roth IRA, and we plan to hold that until the very end. It's tax-free money, tax-free growth. And then we have our taxable accounts. And then we have the equivalent type of stuff in the US as well. So we're going to work on withdrawing our Canadian portfolios first, working on the RSP since it's taxed as ordinary income, and try and be strategic about our tax withdrawals. I'm going to do a kind of a combination of the RSPs and our taxable accounts to keep us. For us, our sweet spot is under 33,000. That will get us that max CCB of 18,000, which would give us, over $50,000 to spend each year, which fingers crossed we don't have to, but it allows for any one-off hiccups, that might be coming down the road type of thing. So that's kind of the thought for now. And then drain the taxable account and then switch over to our US taxable account and drain that. And right around that time frame, if we bring in no other income, is when we would be hitting that 59.5 point for our 401ks. We can't do the whole Roth conversion, being now that we're expats. We don't have access to touch our accounts. So we have to hold our 401ks, or my 401k, as is. So that should bring us right around to that 60 age where we'll start doing that. And then in Canada, we have CPP, which is like OAS, which is going to be small since we didn't work too many years. But we also have OAS down the road when we're 60, 70, which will be at this point, another $700 of, inflation adjusted for each of us. So about another $1,400 simply by being residents of Canada for 40 years. It's something that Canadian citizens get. So that's kind of not that we're living solely off of that, but a mix between 401ks, CPP, OAS. But in our planning, we don't consider CPP, which is like Social Security. We don't consider OAS. We don't consider Canada Child Benefit in any of our numbers. It's really just like icing on the cake when we were deciding, like, can we retire or not? Like I don't know, what CPP is going to look like down the road, or OAS. So I don't want to rely on it. For me, I see it as like a hedge for any sort of medical expenses that might come up, things like that. So that's kind of our general plan is, basically our 401k equivalent combined with some taxable, which has some tax advantages to it. So that will help us keep us in a low tax bracket. And then just the taxable account, which will be pretty easy, even with capital gains, to stay in a very low tax. Well, we won't be paying any taxes, basically, is our plan. Because we don't spend a lot of money, really.
Right.
So it's, it's similar in the States. It's very doable to live on a decent earning, because if it's capital gains, right, only a certain amount is taxed. And that's the beauty of all of this, right? It's like we're able to live on what we consider a healthy figure, but we're not paying any taxes on it because part of it is gains and it's taxed favorably. And so it's just understanding how the tax system works. And I know you guys have harped on this a lot. It's just, it's not doing anything wrong or illegal. It's just being aware of how you should set up your withdrawal portfolio. So for us, for example, like a big no-no would be to withdraw completely from our RRSPs in one given year. Like that would trigger taxes. So instead, we're going to combine it with our taxable account as well to slowly drain that off.
Wow. Okay. So just what you just said in the last 4 minutes, I could probably spend another hour talking about, and maybe we'll do that another time. But goodness, that's amazing, right? So it sounds like, I guess from a very broad view, you set your financial life up, again, not relying on anybody, not relying on the government or luck, or obviously like, oh, these are the programs. That's what I mean by luck, in terms of like, these are the programs that exist now. they're always going to be there. Well, they might not be, right? So, okay, you have your FI number, and it sounds like at a conservative withdrawal rate that would make Big Earn proud, right? Like a 3% or sub 3%. And then you have all of these other things that in all likelihood will still be there to some degree. So it's funny when I hear you say, oh, when we exhaust that account, well, like there's a real possibility you might not draw down or exhaust any or certainly many of these accounts, which is pretty wild. So yeah, I mean, I think that's how a lot of us view Social Security here in the US in terms of like, I think any reasonable person would think there's a very high probability it will still exist for the foreseeable future in some regard, at the minimum 70% of current benefits. That said, I account for it as a zero in my own planning, even though I know intellectually there's a very, very high probability it will still be there. It's just easier to account for it as zero and then be thrilled when it shows up, right? So it sounds like that's what you're doing in terms of, all of your many accounts from Canada. I'm curious. So I love that, like that horse race that you've, or not even horse race, it's just arbitrage, right? Like, hey, we could pay the mortgage off now, but we're only paying a little over 2% in interest to the bank. And we can guarantee lock in essentially what is a CD more or less, or an interest rate from a savings account for over 4%. So that spread is literally just free money. So why wouldn't you do that, right?
Yeah. It's like we got the cash from the townhouse because it was paid off in full. And originally we're like, okay, great. We'll just shift this to the mortgage and be completely mortgage free. But instead of doing that, we just shifted it to a GIC instead. And so we still have the monthly mortgage payments. So when we're taking out and figuring out, our 2 years worth of cash, now we have the mortgage payments to account for. But yeah, it's, when you do all the math and run all the numbers, because we're in a low tax bracket, we don't even have taxes that we have to account for. Taxes would obviously eat away at your earnings of what's being made in the GIC, but by keeping our spend low, it's purely, profit at that point. So yeah, it ends up being close to about $10,000 a year that we will be earning by holding on to the mortgage for 3 years, which is just a little wild. And I don't believe when I do these numbers, and some friends help me with this calculator and everything, and then I'm looking at it, I'm like, this is just a no-brainer. Like, why wouldn't I keep doing this, right? But like sometimes the numbers fool you and you're like, no, it can't be this good. It can't be like this easy, right? And it literally took 5 minutes to set up the GICs online. Like it was not, did not have to fill out all these fancy forms and go into these different offices. Like it was super simple. Then I contacted the mortgage company and one of my friends is a mortgage lender. So just to make sure like everything checks out from their end, I'm like, yeah, that makes total sense. I would do that too. So yeah, it's just like thinking outside of the box like that, right? And there's many ways to do it. Like this is just one example, right? But this requires zero effort. And, I do some coaching now, which I'm actually really enjoying. And that's going to bring in, I know, maybe a couple $1,000s for the year. Like I'm not talking about replacing our income, but it's just this enjoyable thing that we're doing. And it's little things like that. Like when you say you're probably not going to exhaust your accounts, like you're probably very right, because I've only been off officially, for a couple weeks off of my parental leave. And I can already see, the gears going in my brain of like, what can we do? And it's not what can we do because I'm scared and I'm worried from a financial standpoint. It's what can we do to stay engaged, to keep the gears going and keep my brain, still strong, right? And it's like, for me, it's helping and coaching other people. And I'm really enjoying it, and not something that I thought that I would enjoy, right? But again, going back full circle to like have that time to think, it's like, what would I want to do? And this is one of the things. So that's again, going back to that flexibility of like, oh, well, full stop. Once you reach your FI number, you're going to make $0. Like that's probably very unlikely. I mean, it might be the case for the rare minority, right?
That's fine.
Right. When there's nothing wrong with that. And I think there's nothing wrong with earning income too. And I think that gets a lot of like flack from the retirement police. It's like, oh, well, you're not really retired. It's like, I don't need this. Like I can stop doing this whenever I want. Just something that I enjoy that happens to bring in a little money too. So, there's so many things to, dig into with all of this. But basically it's like, if you have the time to think creatively, there will be income sources that do pop up, whatever they may be, whether it's, a volunteer opportunity that turns into a little part-time gig, or just setting up the GICs, it took some time to like look at numbers on a spreadsheet, but otherwise like that's a great paycheck for me. You know what I mean? For relatively little effort. So it's things like that, that really, again, help with that sleep at night factor, just knowing that this is just the beginning. And over the next years, there are going to be other things that do come up that are going to help ease our early retirement journey, basically.
Think creatively, be flexible, right? I mean, it really is a mindset. I think this has been a really great illustration of it. So, Court, loved having you on. As always, can't wait to, we'll definitely have to do round 3 sometime soon. I'd love to have you back on. And so, let everybody know where they can find you and how they can get in touch if they're so inclined.
Yeah, sure. So we have our blog, modernfimily.com, and I'm also on Instagram, also at Modern FImily. I'm not very active anymore. Again, this is part of the whole transition of things that were super interesting before, not as interesting. Like now our focus is more on unschooling and world schooling and alternative schooling. So that's where our brains are going these days. But I do still try to post a blog post hopefully once every 2 weeks or so. And then we also have our coaching tab is like on our website too. So that's where to find me if you need me for anything. And if anyone wants to just send a message, just say hi. Like I love that. So please, by all means, like we said, this is all about connecting. So if there's anyone out there that just wants to say hi, please feel free to reach out.
Nice. Yeah, the blog's fantastic. And again, just I'm kind of like a crazy person / stickler about like spelling things. So it's Modern FImily, but just FImily. So FImily. So modernfimily.com. And yeah, definitely reach out. Like you said, there's that coaching tab up top and you just have a lot of really great content. So Court, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Brad, for having me back. I always love chatting with you.